Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, written by Betty Smith. And this is a semi-autobiographical novel, originally published back in 1943. And this is actually the very first book I read for my high school summer reading. I just remember one summer afternoon sitting down in my dad's chair and reading several chapters of this book. And it is fairly lengthy. It's broken down into 5 books. Book 1 introduces us to the characters, our heroine, Francie Nolan. And at the start of the novel, she is 11 years old. And she and her family live in poverty, and she is ashamed by that. They live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It takes place in the summer of 1912. And that first book, it's just a typical Saturday for them. Her and her brother Neely going to the junk shop to sell junk to earn a few pennies. Her mom cleaning apartments. Her dad, who is a singing waiter, and he just picks up odd jobs whenever he can as a waiter, but sadly he is an alcoholic. And we see the dynamics within the family, the Nolan family, how Francie favors her father, whereas with her mother there is tension because her mother favors Neely. And then book 2 takes us back to 1900 when Johnny and Katie first meet and they fall in love, and first he was dating her friend, but then she was just crazy for him and knew she wanted to spend her life with him. And they get married really young, and then within a year they get pregnant and she gives birth to Francie, and then the following year she gives birth to Neely. And then we learn about her family, her sisters, her sister Evie and her sister Sissy. And then we learn about Johnny's family and his brothers, how each one of them died before they were 35 years old. And then book 2 ends with them moving into the apartment that they're in book 1. And then book 3 is throughout Francie and Neely's time at school. And this is the longest section of this novel. And the main thing that happens, sadly, is that Johnny passes away. And before he died, Katie had whispered something to him. And it turned out what she whispered was that she was pregnant with their 3rd child. And he was trying to get sober. But sadly, he dies of pneumonia and succumbing to his alcoholism. And then there are many other events that happen, but this book ends with Francie and Neely graduating from grade school. Francie at age 14 and Neely at 13. And also, before that, in May of 1916, Katie gives birth to her 3rd child, and she names the baby Annie Laurie after a song that Johnny would sing. And then book 4 is when Francie and Neely each start working. And because they are still poor, only one of them can go to high school. And Francie really wants to go and Neely doesn't. So then Katie says that Neely has to go because Francie will fight for her education. So Francie works full time and she's upset by that. But then she discovers she can take prerequisite courses for college. And she also meets a boy who's a senior in high school named Ben Blake. And he helps her with her college entrance exams. And he's really handsome and smart and has a clear path for his life. But then Francie meets a soldier named Lee Reiner, and she falls for him. But it turns out that he is engaged, and then he ends up getting married. So he was her first love, but he turns out to really just be a coward. And then book 4 ends with Katie accepting a marriage proposal from a sergeant named Michael McShane, who was introduced earlier in book 3 when Katie had thought to herself that someday she was going to marry him, that she just bases things on feeling, that she just knew because his wife was sickly and he never raised any children, and she respected him, and he knew that someday he would be married to her as well, that they would get married. So then by this point he is a retired police officer and has since become a politician. and very wealthy. So then book 5 takes us back to a Saturday in Brooklyn, and now Francie is 16 and a half, and she's going to be starting college, and she'll be going to the University of Michigan. And we just see now Francie going to all of those places she went to in her childhood, the junkyard and the library, because she absolutely loves to read, and she takes her little sister around showing her all these places. And then she's off in a new chapter of her life, still with the promise that maybe one day she'll marry Ben. And when she looks out at the fire escape, she sees a little girl reading, and the little girl's name is Flory, but she says, "Hi, Francie," and "Bye, Francie," as if it's her when she was young, reminiscing about when she was a child growing up in Brooklyn. So that's basically the summary of this novel. And when I read this book when I was younger, I identified a lot with Francie, namely that she is an avid reader, and she's quiet and introspective, yet very smart, and knowing what she wants in life, and very sensitive. But I love just the way it's written. It's just so realistic, obviously based a lot on Betty Smith's own experiences growing up in Brooklyn. And I have a connection with Brooklyn as well, since my grandparents lived there. And Francie, early on, we see how she's a deep thinker, and even in this first chapter, when she's looking at an old man sitting down, it says she played her favorite game, figuring out about people, and it's a whole description about this old man, and then she comes up with the story for him. And we also see early on her appreciation for books. She absolutely loves the library, and every time she goes and asks the librarian to recommend a good book for a girl, and the woman always says, "How old?" "She is 11. And the woman never looks up, but it's always one of 2 books. So I just connected with that as well, since I love to read and also obviously love to write. And as Francie learns throughout her education, she comes to understand the difference between lying and coming up with a story. And then it says, Francie always remembered what that kind teacher told her. "You know, Francie, a lot of people would think that these stories that you're making up all the time were terrible lies because they are not the truth as people see the truth. In the future, when something comes up, you tell exactly how it happened, but write down for yourself the way you think it should have happened. Tell the truth and write the story. Then you won't get mixed up." And then it says, "If she had not found this outlet in writing, she might have grown up to be a tremendous liar." So she uses her imagination and her experiences and writes stories of what she would have liked to have seen or how she would have wanted things to turn out. So that's great advice that I remember reading this that first time that I really liked as well. That with the power of fiction, you can come up with anything. Though with anything you write, there's truth to it, especially obviously taking from personal experiences. But then how you can go off in any direction you want with your characters and with your story. So I appreciate the realism in this novel, and the fact that it's in the early 1900s, how things were so different back then. They would buy things for a penny. Life was simpler yet more difficult, and all they really had was each other. And even early on in the book, they talk about how the Nolans just have this love of life, that they couldn't get enough of life. And that's why Katie falls for Johnny, even though she comes to realize that Johnny, sadly, is an alcoholic, and that makes him not necessarily the greatest husband or father, though Francie just basically idolizes her father. That for him it's just pure affection, whereas with her mother, the two of them are so similar and stubborn that they basically clash. And Katie is harder on Francie because she wants a better life for her, for both of her children, and she realizes that what they need is education. She knows the importance of education for them to have better careers, better lives, not live in poverty. And her sister, Sissy, is a great character as well, because though she is uneducated and she is promiscuous, she was married young And sadly, she had several miscarriages. And though when she finally settles down with her third John, she calls her husband's John, and then she finds out a young girl had gotten pregnant, so then she says she's pregnant, and then she adopts the baby. And then afterwards, when she gets pregnant again, and then she finally does give birth to a healthy baby boy, since she has the 2 children with her third husband, who is actually named Steve. But though she is promiscuous, she knows how to help people. She helps Johnny at the time when he's crying and he just wants a drink, and she just acts motherly towards him. She helps her own sister, who she knows has nerves of steel, that all of the Romley women were made out of thin, invisible steel. And it says, those were the Romley women: Mary, the mother, Evie, Sissy, and Katie, her daughters, and Francie, who would grow up to be a Romley woman even though her name was Nolan. They were all slender, frail creatures with wandering eyes and soft, fluttery voices, but made of steel. So Sissy is the kind of character who knows how to get what she wants without being vindictive or dishonest, but knowing how to embellish the truth when it's needed. For instance, when she pretends to be Francie's mother to help Francie so that she can go to the bathroom whenever she wants when they're at that overcrowded school. Or the fact that she was saying she was pregnant when really she herself wasn't pregnant, but the girl was, and then when she adopts the baby. So she's a great character. And Katie, obviously, is a really strong character. Very smart and intuitive, the way Francie is. And even in the novel, it says the difference between Katie and Johnny. Katie had a fierce desire for survival, which made her a fighter. Johnny had a hankering after immortality, which made him a useless dreamer. And that was the great difference between these two who loved each other so well. So opposites attract, but obviously Katie has a better grasp of reality, and she works hard, and she's always honest with her children. And there's one point where she has this long stream of consciousness after Francie and Neely win this big tree around Christmas time with the guy that throws the trees, and then if they're able to catch it without getting knocked over, they get to keep the tree. And they're so excited when they win it and bring it home. And then as they're lugging up the tree, her children and their father, she has this whole stream of consciousness, and she thinks, she will come to see me and try to make me live in a better way, and I will be mean to her because I'll know she's above me. She will figure out too much about things as she grows older. She'll get to know too much for her own happiness. She'll find out that I don't love her as much as I love the boy. I cannot help it that this is so, but she won't understand that. Sometimes I think she knows that now. Already she is growing away from me. She will fight to get away soon. And then she thinks, but Neely will never leave me. That is why I love him best. He will cling to me and understand me. And then she says, with the boy it will be different. He'll be educated. I must think out ways. We'll not have Johnny with us long. Dear God, I loved him so much once. And sometimes I still do. But he's worthless. Worthless. And God forgive me for ever finding it out. Thus Katie figured out everything in the moments it took them to climb the stairs. People looking up at her smooth, pretty, vivacious face, had no way of knowing about the painfully articulated resolves formulating in her mind. But still, the big thing with Francie and with Katie is that though Francie may just unconditionally love her father, she is more similar to her mother. And jumping ahead to book 4, after Francie gets her heart broken by Lee, and she's asking her mother for advice, and after when she just calls her mother, no longer calling her mama, and Katie thinks to herself, she had called her own mother Mama until the day she had told her that she was going to marry Johnny. She had said, Mother, I'm going to marry. She had never said Mama after that. She had finished growing up when she stopped calling her mother Mama, now Francie. And she realizes Francie is growing up, and she speaks to her honestly about love and relationships, not just as her mother, but as a woman. And Francie, when it comes to intimacy, as she grows older, she realizes she wants someone to not only love her, but to need her. She wants that emotional intimacy. And that's her main dilemma with Ben, that she wishes he wasn't so sure of himself all the time, that if only he could just need her just once. Because by the end of the novel, he had given her his class ring, and it's basically a promise ring that within 5 years, if she still has feelings for him and loves him and wants to be with him, then they will get married. And since she's going off to college, she has to focus on that first. And I don't know if they'll end up together, her and Ben, because she had feelings for him, but then she was just in love with Lee, and then Lee turns out to just be this liar, since he had told her he was engaged, but that it wasn't really anything, and yet then they get married afterwards anyway. So 5 years, it's a long time. She may meet someone else and be happier with a different guy instead of with Ben, but it's left open to interpretation, that even Francie doesn't know, that she had 5 years to figure it out, to see if she and Ben will get married. And her relationship with Neely is really nice too, because growing up, she doesn't really have many friends at all, so she's a lonely child, and she has her brother, and they're just getting through life together as children in poverty. And they're both very smart, and even Francie, by the end of the novel, she sees her father in her brother, how they look similar and that he's so lively and he sings well, but he's obviously much smarter and he doesn't care for alcohol at all, thankfully, so he won't turn out the way his father did in that regard. But there's a nice moment at the end between them when Francie's going to go off to college and Neely's saying, well, we better say goodbye now. He says, there'll be no chance to say goodbye to you alone, so I'll say goodbye now. I'll be home for Christmas, Neely, but it won't be the same, I know. He waited. Francie extended her right hand. He pushed her hand aside, put his arms around her, and kissed her on the cheek. Francie clung to him and started to cry. He pushed her away. Gee, girls make me sick, he said, always so mushy. But his voice was ragged as though he too was going to cry. He turned and ran out of the flat. Francie went out into the hallway and watched him run down the steps. He paused in the well of darkness at the foot of the stairs and turned to look back up at her. Although it was dark, there was brightness where he stood. So like Papa, she thought. But he had more strength in his face than Papa had had. He waved to her, then he was gone. That moment is so sweet, too, because she knows he usually doesn't like to hug and kiss, but then it's sweet that he does it in that moment, because when it was New Year's Eve, they just shake hands. And Francie thinks, Neely, so much like Mama, so much like Papa, the best of each in Neely. She loved her brother. She wanted to put her arms around him and kiss him, but he was like Mama. He hated people to be demonstrative. If she tried to kiss him, he'd get mad and push her away. So she held out her hand instead. Happy New Year, Neely. The same to you. They shook hands solemnly. So that's why I like that moment toward the end as well, when he just pushes her hand away and gives her a kiss. Very cute, very sweet. Made me teary-eyed. I really love the emotional moments in this book. Also, too, when Francie and Neely both come home with their first paychecks for their first jobs, and they buy candy and they rearrange it for their mother to see. And then it says, Katie looked at the candy, at the new bills, and then at her children. She bit her lip, turned suddenly, and went into the bedroom, closing the door after her. Is she mad about something? Whispered Neely. No, said Francie. She's not mad. She just didn't want us to see her start crying. How do you know she's going to cry? 'Cause when she looked at the money, I saw that tears stood in her eyes. That's cute. Also, Francie cries when, after her graduation, she gets roses, and that's what I have on the cover of my copy of this book. It's a picture of Francie holding the roses, And the card says, "For Francie on graduation day, love from Papa." And it turned out that her father had written the card and asked Sissy to buy the flowers for him because he gives her the money for it and write out the card. And it turns out that Sissy explains that, "Francie, about a year ago, he gave me that card all written out and $2. He said, when Francie graduates, send her some flowers for me in case I forget." And then poor Francie cries. It's very touching. But as she grows older and grows up and goes from being a young girl to an adolescent to a young woman, she begins to see things more from her mother's perspective and understand the importance of being needed. When Katie is very pregnant and she tells Francie, "Francie, I expect the baby any day now, and I'd feel better if you were never very far away from me. Stay close to me. And when I'm working, come looking for me from time to time to see that I'm all right. I can't tell you how much I'm counting on you. I can't count on Neely because a boy's no use at a time like this. I need you badly now, and I feel safer when I know you're nearby. So stay close to me for a while." A great tenderness for her mother came into Francie's heart. "I won't ever go away from you, Mama," she said. "That's my good girl." Katie pressed her shoulder. Maybe, thought Francie, she doesn't love me as much as she loves Neely, but she needs me more than she needs him, and I guess being needed is almost good as being loved, maybe better. So that's sweet too. And of course, gotta talk about the title, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and there are several passages describing this tree just growing from the sidewalk. That seems impossible, just this tree growing against the adversity. And of course, it represents Francie herself. When Katie is talking about the tree and she says, "Look at that tree growing up there out of that grating. It gets no sun and water only when it rains. It's growing out of sour earth. And it's strong because its hard struggle to live is making it strong. My children will be strong that way." And then at the start of book 3, talking about the tree growing from the ground outside of their apartment. And it says, "Yet there was this tree growing in the yard. When Francie first saw it, it was only up to the 2nd story. She could look down on it from her window. It looked like a packed crowd of people of assorted sizes, standing umbrella-protected in the rain." And this tree itself is a metaphor not only for Francie growing up against adversity, but for her family, that they still flourish and thrive and succeed, growing up in poverty and becoming successful. And even by the very end of the novel, where it says, "She looked down into the yard. The tree whose leaf umbrellas had curled around under and over her fire escape had been cut down because the housewives complained that wash on the lines got entangled in its branches. The landlord had sent 2 men and they had chopped it down. But the tree hadn't died. It hadn't died. A new tree had grown from the stump, and its trunks had grown along the ground until it reached a place where there was no wash lines above it. Then it had started to grow towards the sky again. Annie, the fir tree, that the Nolans had cherished with waterings and manurings, had long since sickened and died. But this tree in the yard, this tree that men chopped down, this tree that they built a bonfire around, trying to burn up its stump, this tree lived. It lived, and nothing could destroy it." Once more she looked at Florrie Wendy reading on the fire escape. "Goodbye, Francie," she whispered. She closed the window. That's the ending of the novel. So, it's just wonderful, just this metaphor for beating the odds. That with everything trying to get you down, it can't break them. It can't stop them from living their lives and beating the odds, overcoming hardship, and still staying connected to your roots. Because Francie, too, just taking such pride in Brooklyn that no matter where she goes, something will just always remind her of Brooklyn. Everything will always be tied back to her hometown of Brooklyn. It's very sweet. Such a wonderful novel. very insightful about life and growing up and understanding all of these different types of love and finding courage and not wallowing in one's hardships. Finding happiness and purpose and meaning and all the wonderful things of life. So, beautiful novel. And the setting of Brooklyn itself has just so much heart in it. And I admire and relate to Francie in many ways. She's a great literary heroine, one of my favorites for sure. So it's just an absolutely beautiful novel. I love it, and Brooklyn, too, has a special place in my heart, as does this novel. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'll be doing some more personal stories. The topic this time, Cousin Chronicles. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.